we're now joined by Professor Ebbe Volquardsen, an associate professor at the Institute of Culture, Language and History at the University of Greenland in Nuuk. Professor Volquardsen, how have the people in Greenland reacted to the renewed US interests?
Well, for a country like Greenland, it is not a common thing to be mentioned by a US president on the day of his inauguration. And when this comes with certain threats, this is, of course, an unpleasant situation. So I believe a lot of people are a little bit worried. And there has also been a poll saying that half of the population is mostly worried. But the other half also sees some opportunities in this global focus of attention, which is on Greenland. It has been so for the last weeks. Yeah, they see also some positive sides in that.
Great. I do want to drill into those positive sides too. But coming from the US point of view, Donald Trump has made overtures to Greenland during his last tenure. What has changed this time for the Greenlanders?
Yeah, last time that was at the end of his tenure. And it wasn't maybe not being taken that serious back then. Although already back then, his claims or his comments had an impact on Greenland and especially on Greenland's relationship with its former colonial power, Denmark, which still is in a sort of union with. So in a way, Donald Trump back then has done the Greenlanders a favor without wanting to do so, because his claims underline the value of being in a union with Greenland, and that strengthened Greenland's bargaining position in the dialogue with Denmark, from where they could demand more autonomy and a recognition of historical injustices. This is something that actually has also happened within the last 5 years. So the relationship between Denmark and Greenland has changed quite a lot. And you could say that Denmark has made concessions to the demands that Greenlanders have had for a very long time. And this is maybe even more the case after the renewed claims and comments from Donald Trump, that it looks like as if there is a fair chance that the relationship between Denmark and Greenland might change even more into a direction where there is more equality and more respect. And this is, of course, a positive side effect.
I do want to talk about how this can be leveraged. But before I go into that, would you say there is a scenario, and I understand you mentioned this poll, but is there a scenario where Greenlanders would consider being part of US territory?
What Greenlanders want and have wanted for a long time is become a sovereign state one day. And the recent polls say the same thing. So around 85% of the population want Greenland to be an independent state in the future. So it's not a question of if, it's more a question of when and how. There is a really small minority, almost no one, I believe, that would like to become part of the United States. So as the Prime Minister Ebbe repeatedly said, also on Fox News, the Greenlanders don't want to be Americans, but they don't want to be Danes either. They want to be Greenlanders, but they're also aware of that they need strong partners. And until now, this partner has been Denmark, and maybe it will be in the future as well. I don't think that Greenlanders want to cut the ties to Copenhagen. This is also often misunderstood, but they want a more equal relationship and they want more autonomy. And first of all, they want to diversify their dependency. So they want to stop this bilateral relationship of dependence between Denmark and Greenland, and also look west and have trade relations with Canada and the United States, maybe the EU, Great Britain, other partners in terms of trade, but also in terms of cooperation in politics, culture, education, whatever. That is a very natural thing, I believe. The fact that there has been this unilateral um, relationship with Denmark is, of course, a remnant of the colonial past. So it is quite artificial, actually, that everything in trade, in in travel, but also cultural relations thus far have been going through Copenhagen, which is 4,000 kilometers away from here, whereas Canada, for instance, only is a few hundred kilometers away, just over the strait.
Is there a possibility of the US expanding its bases in Greenland? Is that something Greenlanders would be open to?
All Greenlandic politicians I know and I have heard have repeatedly stated that they are very open towards negotiations and agreements with the United States, among others. And everyone in Greenland is aware of that we, as part of Denmark or the Kingdom of Denmark, and thus also a part of NATO, are dependent on the Americans. So I believe there would be a great openness towards any new agreements, also when it comes to national, international security.
Right. Saying that the U.S. is national and international security, but the U.S., and this is what has changed and is possibly concerning Greenlanders a lot, has said, well, Trump has indicated that the U.S. would or could take Greenland by force if necessary. A very, very dangerous tone that's taking. Is that being taken seriously in Greenland? And is that something that the decision makers are considering?
I'm sure it's taken seriously, both in Greenland and in Denmark. But I mean, it's quite a bizarre scenario, of course, because that would probably mean the end of NATO and the alliance between with the Western nations as we know it. So maybe it can be avoided.
And what would you say is the current conversation of people in Greenland right now? What are you seeing in media, hearing media? Is this being talked about much, the fact that the US interests, or is it something that's being left to the policymakers?
I think that many people are in a way surprised by the the sudden willingness of Denmark making concessions to Greenlanders in different aspects, and even sort of redefining their national identity from Denmark being a state of Danes, where Danish is spoken, like a homogeneous national state, towards something you almost could call a federation, where you really acknowledge the fact that Denmark proper is in that union together with Greenland and the Faroe Islands, by the way. And that is quite remarkable how far Denmark stretches itself, because people in Denmark really seem to have understood that there is a possibility that Greenland might become independent or enter a union with another partner. So they now really begin to listen and understand that to change their attitudes towards Greenland and Greenlanders in order to have a good relationship with their former colony in the future. And that is something that people talk a lot about.
You mentioned how this sudden attention towards Greenland has given perhaps Greenlanders a little bit more leveraging point in reclaiming their rights or claiming their rights with Denmark. Can you explain some of the things or some of the positive movements we have seen, the silver lining to this for Greenlanders?
Absolutely. So, the decades after the Second World War, the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s, were marked by something you might call an assimilation policy. During these decades, Greenland was no longer a proper colony, but was integrated into the Danish state as a formally equal province or county. And that meant that Denmark had to change and adapt the lifestyles of the Greenlanders to the lifestyles of the citizens of the Danish welfare state. So that turned Greenlanders' lives upside down, and a very rapid modernization or assimilation policy was exercised. And this came, of course, with different measures that have been felt as abuses, encroachments, or injustices. And it is only recently that Denmark is beginning to acknowledge that things that happened in the not so distant past have been wrong, and that these traumas still are felt very much by Greenlanders today, and they are also passed on to the next generations, just like with any indigenous people in the world. I mean, there are parallels to Australia, New Zealand, the United States, Canada, you name it. And this is a process which only now has begun, maybe around 2019, 2020, that Denmark is acknowledging this, and that commissions are beginning to do research on these issues and find out what actually has happened. And beyond that, there is also a process you can see where Greenlandic people are more representing the entire state of Denmark. So there is a more equal relationship where it is possible that a person from Greenland also can have a position for the entire union of the Danish kingdom. For instance, the so-called Arctic ambassador, that was a huge conflict, is now being appointed from Greenland. And then there are some examples on the symbolic side who are quite in line with the aforementioned things. For instance, a Greenlandic artist, the great photographer Inottek Stork, has recently represented Denmark at the Biennale in Venice. And then there will be a new series of Danish banknotes that are also used in Greenland with a historical Greenlandic person on it. So there are so many things that have been unthinkable before, that even Danish national symbols now include Greenlanders and the history of Greenland.
And if you had to pin down a few of the changes that have been made since the inauguration, so since this year, what would they be? And I'm not talking necessarily, optically or people being put into positions, but more about rights. Have there been any movements in giving Greenlanders more rights over their own, unique culture and their backgrounds?
Oh yes, absolutely. I mean, we're talking about only a few weeks now. So all the things I mentioned before, that is something that actually had happened before already. But the last case of criticism and protest was about parental rights of Greenlandic mothers living in Denmark. You have to imagine there's a Greenlandic diaspora living in Denmark as well, around 17,000 people or so. And there was, kind of a scandal that it showed that the Danish municipalities were taking away the custody of children from mothers of Greenlandic descent on the basis of some parental tests that were not adapted to the Greenlandic language and culture. So this has been the reason for huge demonstrations both in Denmark and Greenland, and it had been quite difficult, or Denmark at least argued that it would be quite difficult to find a solution for that. And all of a sudden, just a few days after the new Trump claims, there was a solution for that. And then there will be another program against racism against Greenlanders in Denmark, which many Greenlanders experience to this day. Also, a very sudden decision that this needs to be done, although Greenlanders had been demanding things like that for years. So there are several examples, yes.
Greenland's Prime Minister has stepped up a push for independence and repeatedly has said the island is not for sale and it is up to the people of Greenland to decide their future. Saying that, can you see, given that it seems, there's a lot of international attention on Greenland, can you see that push for independence becoming stronger?
Yes and no. I mean, this was the first time the international media were interested in a New Year's speech given by the Greenlandic Prime Minister, and I think the Greenlandic Prime Minister was quite aware of that. But what he actually said was not that new. There is a large consensus among the Greenlandic political parties in Parliament that they are going for independence in one way or the other. So it's a question about the speed and the way how it is done. So this New Year's speech didn't come as a huge surprise for anyone here in Greenland. But with this being said, of course, the situation is a new one. And given all the things we have been talking about before, the concessions Denmark is making and the maybe the will to change attitudes towards Greenland as a more inclusive state identity and really leaving behind this arrogant and paternalistic attitudes from colonial times. I believe there might actually be a chance to negotiate a totally different model of cooperation, which is not the union that they are having now with some cosmetical changes, but a totally new model that might be something like a free state association, which some island nations in the Pacific do have today.
So, one thing we're also seeing now is that Greenland is starting to be more connected to the rest of the world, or there are moves to make it more connected to the rest of the world. Can you tell us what's happening there?
Yeah, until now, Greenland is very dependent on the fishing industry, which makes like 98% of its exports. So, also with this independence agenda in mind, it is crucial for Greenland to diversify not only its trade relations with other countries, but also its industries in the country itself. And there is mining, of course, which is a big thing. But another thing is tourism. So there are huge potentials for tourism, and this is something where, we see a lot of changes actually. And one big change is that there now is an international airport in Nuuk. Until recently, you had to change flights in a former American airbase in the middle of nowhere, which made it a little bit more expensive and a little bit more time consuming to come here. Now you can fly directly to Nuuk from both Reykjavik in Iceland and Copenhagen in Denmark, and from summer on there will be a direct flight to the United States to New York. So, and we are expecting that more flight airlines will maybe open direct connections as well. So this is very interesting. So we are looking forward to a season with a lot more guests.
Has there been any effort for the US to win hearts and mind rather than this kind of strong armed rhetoric?
Oh, definitely. Already before the last comments here from Donald Trump. So the Americans have opened a consulate recently, some years ago. This is new. And there have, as far as I experienced, been quite good cooperations on a cultural basis. But I'm not sure if the last comments and claims from the president are a way to win the hearts and minds of the people. I actually pretty much doubt that. What we have seen is, of course, that went through the world press the visit of Donald Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., on the 7th of January, a few days before his father again became president. And this, of course, was quite clear to everyone that this visit was about propaganda. So what he wanted to do, or what he actually did, was filming videos for his social media channels, staged videos, where he wanted to give the impression that Greenlanders actually want to be annexed by the United States, which is definitely not the case. So he paid homeless people and teenagers for wearing these MAGA hats and saying something positive about the United States to the camera. But this was all staged and definitely not a way to win people's heart and minds. But on the other hand, we have to admit that the Trump campaign obviously follows the debate very closely, and they use Greenlanders' legitimate criticism of Denmark and the past injustices for their purpose.
Going forward, given this probably unprecedented attention we're now seeing towards Greenland, both by the international media and then, Washington's focus on it, and now Denmark willing to give concessions or have that conversation. What do you think is the best case scenario for Greenland here? And what should they be doing at this point to make life ideal for Greenlanders?
Well, it's not up to me to decide. So the best case for Greenland, I believe, would be situations where Greenlanders finally can decide on their own what they want, and that would be, well, if it's an independent state, if that's their choice, then go for it, and hopefully it will be in a solid and good cooperation with one or several other partners. So I wish for Greenland that people can be proud of their nation's rich culture and history, that they don't have to feel ashamed of their identity, of their ethnicity, and that they can move forward, with a lot of self-esteem, and a good partnership as one among other nations, as one equal nation among other nations.